Hello and welcome to the Storm Scripture. We are continuing our brisk walk through the book of Isaiah. In this section, we're going to see several images that are picked up on in the New Testament to describe Jesus. One of those is as the cornerstone, a stone of salvation for those who trust in him, and a stone of stumbling for those who reject him. We will also see a passage that talks about the Jewish leaders being so engrossed in the rules that they forget about a relationship, and a passage that anticipates the Jewish rejection of Jesus, at least at the level of the Jewish leaders. And we will see a passage that exalts the power of God over any human wisdom, a passage that Paul will make use of in the New Testament. Thank you for joining me as we examine the treasures in the book of Isaiah, chapters 28 through 32. I want to walk through these chapters at a high level, as we've done each time, so that we can get a sense of the flow. However, this is not going to be quite as high a level as I have done in the past, because these chapters are full of some very detailed descriptions that I could not find a way of summarizing. Isaiah is a prophet to the southern kingdom, but he often alludes to what's going on in the northern kingdom, because that is a warning to the southern kingdom that if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to fall into the same path as the northern kingdom is with regard to Assyria and Assyrian power and dominance over that region, and eventually exile to the northern kingdom altogether. So the northern kingdom is kind of an object lesson for the southern kingdom that they should learn from. And that's a bit why we have this message for the northern kingdom in chapter 28. The southern kingdom is always there as an observer and someone who should be learning by the example of their northern neighbors. In verses 1 through 6, Isaiah contrasts the beauty and strength of Samaria, which is the capital city of the northern kingdom, located within the tribe of Ephraim, with the ugliness of its sin and the weakness of its leaders. In verses 7 through 13, Isaiah criticizes specifically the excess of wine among the leaders of Israel and Judah by implication. Again, what he condemns in the north is equally condemned by implication in the south. Those leaders in the north, or perhaps in the south, have been apparently mocking Isaiah for speaking in simplistic precepts as if he was speaking to children. We don't have examples of this simplistic message, but it does seem to be that the leaders are mocking Isaiah with their words in this passage, and Isaiah counters their mocking by saying that if they won't learn and practice the precepts he's trying to teach them by hearing them from a man who speaks their own language, they're going to be forced to learn their lessons through the brutality of those who don't speak their language. The messages are going to be the same, but the means of teaching them going to be quite different. You're going to have to learn your lesson the hard way or the easy way. If they don't learn it the easy way with Isaiah, they will be learning it the hard way from their oppressors. In verses 14 through 22, Isaiah reminds them that God had put a tested stone in Zion. This image means that God had provided the security that the people of Judah could trust completely. But rather than trust in that foundation that God had prepared, the leaders have, quote, made a covenant with death, end quote. This can be taken literally, as if those leaders were worshiping the god of death called Mot, which is entirely within the realm of possibility, or it could be a metaphor for the fact that they're making alliances or covenants with the nations that are eventually going to turn on them in destruction. In the last few verses of this chapter, Isaiah gives some proverbial wisdom. Isaiah uses a wide variety of genres and techniques. We've already seen how he writes almost like a psalm in a couple of chapters. And here it's like he's writing from the book of Proverbs. But the proverbial wisdom is showing that if people would follow the natural law that's all around them, if they would use common sense in how they behave towards one another and toward their crops, which is the proverb. Proverb is using their agricultural wisdom as an example of the kind of wisdom they need to use in their own relationships to each other and to foreign nations. But if they would do the things that are good for the thriving of the people under their care, they would be reflecting God's own wisdom. Even if they just did things that were common sense, it would be godly wisdom because God has provided for them the tools to learn from their environment and do the things that promote thriving. But they're not even doing that. Moving on to chapter 29, the overarching theme of this chapter is that God is going to besiege Jerusalem, although that siege will have an unexpected outcome. In verses 1 through 4, God calls Jerusalem Ariel, a term that can be interpreted two ways. It can be positive because it could mean God's lion, but it could be negative because it's a proper name and it's not clear what the root word is in the name. If you subdivide it one way, you get God's lion. If you subdivide it another way, it means the burned hearth. It could mean that something is burned up, charred, unusable. And that ambiguity in the term as to whether it could be good or whether it could be bad may be part of why Isaiah is using it, why God is using it to describe Jerusalem, because there could be a good outcome or a bad outcome, depending on how the people respond to him. But the message here is that just as David besieged Jerusalem in order to conquer it and take it from the Canaanites, the Jebusites who originally occupied the city before David took it, and that's described in 2 Samuel chapter 5, if you want all that cross-reference. God is also going to besiege Jerusalem in the future, using the nations that surround Jerusalem to do it. Now, all of that, the fact that he's going to use nations that surround Jerusalem is not clear from these verses, but it does follow from the rest of the context. Because in verses 5 through 8, we see that the besieging of Jerusalem doesn't end, as one might expect, with Jerusalem's destruction. But it ends with the destruction of those who are besieging it. Now, obviously, if God himself was besieging it in person, he would not be destroyed. But the picture is that God is using the nations to besiege Jerusalem. And yet, after they have done so, and after Jerusalem has apparently suffered some loss in the process, those nations will themselves be destroyed. There's a dreaming metaphor here that the nations are like dreaming of feasting. In the dream metaphor, it's literally on some food, but it seems to mean them dreaming of feasting on Jerusalem, on the booty that they will take when they destroy Jerusalem. That's their dream, that's their aspiration. But when they wake up from the dream, they're going to find themselves still hungry because Jerusalem is not going to fall to them. They will not be feasting on Jerusalem. There's a shift in the idea in verses 9 through 12 on why the people are not going to receive the words of the prophecy. There are four reasons that are given in more picturesque language, but they boil down to this. First, they're simply willfully ignorant. They refuse to listen, they shut their ears, and are willfully turning away from the message. Another possibility, the second one, is that they are prevented from understanding it by God's design. God has something up his sleeve, if you will. God has something that he has planned to happen. And part of making that plan unfold is that the people won't understand and respond as they would, because if they would respond, his design would not unfold, and nothing is going to stop God's design. So it's possible that they're prevented from understanding it because God has plans for what's going to happen when they don't. Third option is that the prophecy is sealed. That could mean that it's simply unavailable. We have the sealing of prophecy described in Daniel. We have an unsealed prophecy described in the book of Revelation. The prophecy is not sealed because it is imminent. But when a prophecy is sealed, then it's not for the current generation. And so that may be one reason why people don't receive the words of the prophecy, is because it's not for them in their generation. Another possibility that's raised is that they're simply illiterate. We are talking about prophecy that is written down and conveyed by words on a page. Isaiah may be speaking them orally, but they're being recorded on some kind of material, stones, parchment, papyrus, something, and that's going to be passed along. And if you take a written prophecy to somebody who can't read, it does them no good. So that's one other possibility that's raised in these verses. In verses 13 through 24, there's a little bit of an elaboration on this, describing two different groups. First, he describes people who acknowledge God, and yet they only follow his commands by rote. They do not follow them with the discernment that comes from genuinely being in awe of God, following God because of his quality and nature and his holiness and righteousness and power. They don't follow God for any of that. They only follow his commands because they are expected to. They do what is expected of them, but not out of any acknowledgement or awe of God himself. The second group described are people who don't even acknowledge that God exists, and they think that they themselves are the only decision makers that matter. Even if they believe in divine beings and God or gods, they don't think that they have anything to do with their decision making and what governs their lives, so they discount them altogether. God promises that the status quo in this world will be turned on its head to benefit those people who are suffering at the hands of these two groups, and to the detriment of those who are oppressing the righteous. In chapter 30, there's a very particular warning against looking to Egypt for help. This once again sets us in the historical moment of Isaiah's particular situation. Assyria being dominant in the region, it would be natural for Israel to look to Egypt for help. And in fact, we've already seen in previous chapters that there have been some Canaanite groups who have reached out to Egypt, and they didn't fare any better for having done so. Assyria was still crushing them. Well, this chapter is very explicitly for the Judah leaders, the leaders of Judah, not to reach out to Egypt for help in their plight. In verses 1 through 7, God calls the leaders of Judah stubborn children for making a plan to rely on Egypt as an ally without first looking for God's direction. It's not out of the question that even God might approve, but they didn't even ask. They just made a plan for what they're going to do, and they didn't ask God. That puts them back in that one of the characteristics of one of those four from the previous chapter, the people who think that only their decision making matters and they don't take God into account. Well, these leaders in Judah here in chapter 30 are doing exactly that. They're making their plan. They don't take God into account. In this section, God uses some animals of Egypt as a kind of fable description, using animals to make the point. They use some animals that are native to Egypt to frame the picture of Egypt as a worthless savior. Verses 8 through 17, God tells Isaiah to record the warning in a book so that later they can go back and see the evidence of their rebellion. In other words, Write this down, because in a few years, they're going to look back at what you wrote now and see just how right you were and how wrong they were for what they did. The people are not listening to Isaiah and his preaching that is from God, but instead only listening to prophets that say what the people want to hear. God warns that their iniquity will be the very thing that causes their stability to be shattered. As with similar prophecies in the future, there's a middle hopeful pivot point in between their criticism and warning and condemnation. And in verses 18 through 26, we have this hopeful middle where God is pictured as waiting for the right time, and then he will be gracious and be a blessing for those who wait for him. If you're not waiting for him and going off on your own thing, you're going to end up in dire straits. But if you know that God is simply waiting for the right time and you are patient to wait for him, then you will be blessed. And Isaiah describes another scene of Jerusalem as a place of blessing and a place of plenty and of joy that is fitting for the New Jerusalem, like we read of in the book of Revelation. This passage probably helps to inspire the framing of the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation. In verses 27 through 33, we have the end of the hopeful section, and the tone of judgment and destruction resumes here with a picture of God arriving with anger and fury and a tongue like a devouring fire. Yet even in the middle of this, there's verse 29, which describes people keeping a holy feast with gladness, playing a flute in celebration on the mountain of the Lord. It's a moment of joy that is surrounded by the furious anger and terror-stricken Assyrians, a detail that is drawn from the current moment, but it's kind of placed in a picture of this eschatological judgment, because this all does seem to point towards that future time. I think we could almost see this description here like the description of the 144,000 on Mount Zion in the book of Revelation, where they sing the song that only they can learn from the heavenly chorus. And yet all around them is the judgment that God is pouring out. But in that one moment, the people who are gathered in Zion sing and celebrate their connection to the Lamb. Well, let's move on to the next couple of chapters, this chapters 31 and 32, to close this out. It is a message of woe to those who rely on Egypt and blessing for those who wait for the Lord. In chapter 31, 1 through 9, which is the whole chapter, Isaiah summarizes the problems with relying on Egypt. And really, Egypt just stands in for any kind of human help, human power, ingenuity, wisdom. If you're relying on that human help, then you're going to be disappointed. He contrasts that with the confidence of relying on God. God is likened to a lion, and here the word is very similar to Ariel. I mentioned how Ariel could be described as Lion of God. Well, in chapter 31, God is the lion in the picture. And God is also likened to a flock of birds that are hovering over the city of Jerusalem, and they are able to protect and rescue it. Isaiah exhorts the people to turn back to God, because the Assyrian will not fall by the sword of a man, but by the sword of God. As with chapter 29, the Assyrian seems to stand in as a metaphor for the opponents to God. It may not be Assyria per se, but Assyria is the enemy de jure in the days of Isaiah. That may be why he refers to the Assyrian as that example. But they seem to stand in for any of the opponents of God now or in the eschaton at the end of days. We are talking about the end of days because chapter 32 describes this future king of righteousness. In chapter 32, verses 1 through 8, Isaiah contrasts that future king who reigns in righteousness and with loyal princes ruling justly under him with the current leaders in Jerusalem who are described as fools and scoundrels and wicked. In chapter 32, verses 9 through 20, Isaiah turns specifically to the wealthy women of Jerusalem and Judah that live their life of ease. He warns them that that life of ease is about to get torn away, leaving them in sackcloth, living in a forsaken wilderness. However, God will eventually pour out his spirit and enact a change in the fortunes that he has promised, leading to peace for the righteous and secure, quiet resting places for the people of God. We're going to step into our verse-by-verse examination of certain parts of these chapters next. I want to start with a passage from Isaiah 28. All of the passages that I have chosen to drill down on in this lesson, I have chosen them because they are echoed in the New Testament in some way or another. This is from Isaiah chapter 28, verses 9 through 13. Now, this is the point where the commentary suggests that these comments here, starting in verse 9, begin with the people mocking Isaiah. There's nothing in the text that says the leaders of Judah mock Isaiah, but the phrasing seems to be in a mocking style, and what follows up seems to be a response to these comments. So we have, presumably, the leaders mocking Isaiah by saying, "To whom will he teach knowledge? And to whom will he explain the message? Those who are weaned from the milk, those taken from the breast? For it's precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little." That's the way I would hear it delivered. And when they say, who is he going to teach? Babies, the ones who barely weaned off their mother's milk? That's kind of their implication. Isaiah has been teaching like to a baby. And maybe he has been using a simple message, but that message can be quite simple and still true and powerful. Rely on God. Trust in him. But they're not even listening to Isaiah's simple message. But Isaiah seems to reply to this mockery with his own words when he says, "For by people of strange lips and with a foreign tongue the Lord will speak to this people, to whom he has said, this is rest. Give rest to the weary. This is repose." That might be some of the simple language he's been using to the people. This is rest. Rely on the Lord. Yet they would not hear, he says. "And the word of the Lord will be to them precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little, that they may go and fall backward and be broken and snared and taken." So that last part about being broken and snared and taken, those are all verbs that are associated with being taken into exile, oppressed. So the message is, if you're not going to hear this message from me, who I have already told you the truth, you're going to hear it from the foreign-tongued people, and those would be those who are going to put you in exile. Then maybe you'll learn to rely on God when that's all you can do because you've been taken by the enemy. That is apparently the original context. This passage, though, the part I have highlighted on the slide, "For by a people of strange lips and with a foreign tongue, the Lord will speak to this people," and then the additional phrasing, "yet they would not hear," this is picked up in a very surprising context in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, while Paul is discussing speaking in tongues. I puzzled over this quotation in Paul in 1 Corinthians 14 for quite a bit. because it does not seem to flow with the main point of his argument. And after considering how he's making his point, I've decided that this verse is probably being quoted by the Corinthians. This is one interpretive approach taken by some commentaries. They may not say the quotation is a citation of what the Corinthians have been saying, but they will say that verse 22 is something that the Corinthians have been saying, and Paul is going to reply to it. But I think that the quotation dovetails with the verse 22. The quotation is in verse 21. So I think that, again, the Corinthians saying this is not in the text. It's an implication. But if you read through 1 Corinthians in more than one place, Paul, without introduction, without explaining what he's doing, Paul will quote what is plainly something wrong, because he refutes it in his next couple of verses. So he'll quote something wrong, and the presumption is that he's quoting something that the Corinthians have been saying, or maybe something they wrote to him and said, this is what we think, this is what we're doing, and Paul is correcting their line of thinking. And this part of the book is not always identified as being that kind of back and forth, but I do think it makes sense if it is. So here is my take on these verses, that the Corinthians have been saying this. They've quoting this passage from Isaiah. In the law it is written, by people of strange tongues and by the lips of foreigners will I speak to this people, and even then they will not listen to me, says the Lord. Thus, tongues are a sign not for believers, but for unbelievers, while prophecy is a sign not for unbelievers, but for believers. I think it makes sense if this is what the Corinthians have been saying and it's not entirely accurate. That's not always taken. Some people will take verse 22. Tongues are a sign not for believers, but for unbelievers. And prophecy is a sign not for unbelievers, but for believers. And they will assert that that is Paul's intention. That is what Paul is affirming, this idea. I think it makes sense if we see Paul pushing back against this idea in the next couple of verses. The Corinthians may be citing this passage in Isaiah as support or evidence that tongues are a sign for non-believers, because Isaiah describes speaking in these tongues, strange tongues, as coming from foreigners. So the passage in Isaiah sort of equates or connects these strange tongues with foreigners. There's one train of thought that thinks that speaking in tongues is simply speaking in foreign languages in the New Testament, and maybe there's some connection here that is being implied by this citation. At a minimum, the Corinthians are making this equation and saying speaking in tongues is for the unbelievers, the people who are not part of our community, whereas the prophecy is for the people in our community. And they've drawn this hard and fast line between the two, like never the twain shall meet. Tongues for them, prophecy for us. And that's where we're going to put our emphasis in our worship services, which is really the bigger context of chapter 14, is what's going on in their worship services when they come together. And this seems to be one line that the Corinthians are drawing. And I don't think Paul agrees with that line. And let's look at the next couple of verses to see why. This is 1 Corinthians 14, verses 23 through 25. I believe this is Paul responding with a critique to the words he's just cited. He says, if, therefore, the whole church comes together and all speak in tongues, and outsiders or unbelievers enter, will they not say that you're out of your mind? But if all prophesy and an unbeliever or outsider enters, he's convicted by all. He's called to account by all. The secrets of his heart are disclosed, and so, falling on his face, he will worship God and declare that God is really among you. The line of thinking is, this is not the line of demarcation. You don't just talk in tongues to the foreigners, because if that's all they experience, they're going to say you're out of your mind. The phrase out of your minds is harsher in English than it was in Greek when Paul wrote this. I don't think he meant to imply that the foreigners coming into the worship are going to call them crazy, like we would say. That's what we would mean if we said you're out of your mind. You're just crazy. It's crazy talk. It's just foolish or babbling meaninglessness. I don't think that's what he means when he says you're out of your minds. If you look through the passage, I read through the passage, the longer context of 1 Corinthians 14, he talks about praying in a tongue, and that is praying with his spirit, not with his mind. The contrast here is not between coherence and incoherence, like out of your mind is incoherent. It's not between sanity and insanity. The difference here is between participating with your spirit or participating with your mind, with your intellect. And so he's saying these outsiders will come in and they think that you're just not using any rational thought. You're just responding with your feelings. This is just about your feelings. It's not rational. And they may find that as an excuse to walk away, because if they find you irrational, they may not listen to what you have to say. So I think that's the emphasis when he says they'll come in and say you're out of your minds. Not that you're crazy, but that you're just being emotional and not really thinking. I think that's the critique that he means to suggest there. And so he says, look, if everybody's talking in tongues, that's going to be the impression you make. It's all emotional and it's not mental at all. It's not thoughtful at all. But what if they come in? What if these unbelievers walk in and you're prophesying, which is in the context not predicting the future, it's speaking the truth of God's word, proclaiming God's truth. If you are proclaiming the truth in a way that they can understand it, they'll respond. So I think he makes the point that it's the opposite of what they were saying in verse 22. Tongues are for non-believers, prophesy is for believers. No, it's not like that, because the unbelievers will actually get more out of the prophecy than they will from the tongues. But he doesn't say that there should be no tongues, and he also doesn't say there should be no prophecy. The next part of 1 Corinthians 14, which I won't get into in the detail, is when you all come together, you all have something to share. Some people have tongues to share. Some people have prophecy to share. Do it all in decency and in order, but make sure it's all together. Don't try to make this subdivision and say, this is for them, and this is for us, and that's all there is. That's not logical, and it's not going to work out. That's the message in 1 Corinthians 14, verses 21 through 25. So I think this citation of Isaiah is actually not really pertinent to the bigger context. I think it was just the Corinthians trying to grasp at some verse that they thought justified their excluding prophecy from sharing that with the unbelievers, and only trying to appeal to them through tongues, which Paul says isn't going to work as a general rule. That's what we have going on with 1 Corinthians. That took me a little bit of a noodle, and I am perfectly willing to be wrong about that. So if you have read a better explanation for why that verse from Isaiah pops up in this context, or the argument of 1 Corinthians 14, 21 through 25, I am all ears if you want to share that with me. What they were speaking when they spoke in tongues as foreign languages, because that's the example from Acts chapter 2, is that people were hearing in their own native tongues what was being said. What they were hearing was a language, a human language, being spoken presumably by someone who had never studied it. Trying to square that with Paul's statement that if they hear you, they'll think you're out of your minds if everybody is speaking in tongues. Maybe he's referring to the kind of cacophony that would come if lots of people are talking in different languages. Consider the effect that your actions are having on the person you're talking to. This is definitely a message of both and, because Paul immediately follows this discussion with the fact that when you all come together, you all have something to say. You've got people who want to speak in a tongue. No more than 2 or 3 should do it. There needs to be an interpreter. And then that followed up with the prophecy. You've got people who are speaking in prophecy. Let them one at a time share it. And if somebody else thinks they have something to say while the first person is talking, let the first person be quiet and the second person explain. He's saying, look, tongues, they have their place. They just need to be done decently and in order. Prophecy has its place. Don't draw lines and just say we're all about one or the other. It's a both and for sure. All right, let's look at another passage from Isaiah chapter 28, verses 15 through 17. Because you've said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we have an agreement. When the overwhelming whip passes through, it will not come to us. For we have made lies our refuge, and in falsehood we have taken shelter. That's probably not... Isaiah is probably putting words in their mouth to characterize how wrong they are about the assumptions they made about what will make them safe and what will not make them safe. But he continues here. He says, therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am the one who has laid a foundation in Zion, a stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone of a sure foundation. Whoever believes will not be in haste. And I will make justice the line, and righteousness the plumb line, and hail will sweep away the refuge of lies, and waters will overwhelm the shelter. So contrasting here between the so-called covenant with death that the leaders of Judah have made, possibly by reaching out to Assyria as an ally, which they did in order to counteract the northern kingdom and Syria, back when we were talking about the early chapters in Isaiah. They made this covenant, but it's not going to save them. On the contrast to that bad covenant is God, who has given them what they need. He has already put a foundation in Zion. He repeats himself, a stone, a tested stone, precious cornerstone. There's something solid here to hang on to, something that is not going to be frail, something you can depend on. And if you believe in what God has done, you will not be in haste. The idea of being in haste means like fleeing for your lives, running away. You won't have to panic and run because you can hold on to the cornerstone. But the cornerstone is not the end of the story, because when he says righteousness is a plumb line, why do you need a plumb line? Because you're building something. The cornerstone is only the beginning of the building. The foundation is only the start. God says through Isaiah, I will make justice the line, righteousness the plumb line. That means there's going to be more construction. This isn't going to end with the stone. It starts there, and it builds from there. Well, this is, of course, an image that is used in the New Testament. And I want to go first to the usage of it in 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 8. As you come to him, that is to Jesus, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious. You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up in a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. So the honor is for you who believe, but for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become a cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling, and a rock of offense. They stumble because they disobey the word as they were destined to do. So Peter quotes Isaiah 28, verses 15 through 17. He quotes the Zion, a cornerstone. But he also quotes a different part of Isaiah that we've already looked at, the stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. That phrase comes from Isaiah chapter 8. So on the one hand, those who believe, Jesus is the cornerstone, but for those who don't believe, he's the stone of stumbling and the rock of offense. I want to read the passage from Isaiah 8 to put that back in context. Isaiah 8:11 through 15. For the Lord spoke thus to me with his strong hand upon me, and warned me not to walk in the way of this people, saying, do not call conspiracy all that this people call conspiracy, and do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. But the Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. And he will become a sanctuary, and a stone of offense and a rock of stumbling to both houses of Israel, a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many shall stumble on it, they shall fall and be broken, they shall be snared and taken. So in Isaiah 8, we have this same contrast. The very same stone is for some people a sanctuary, and for others, a rock of stumbling. It's all about how you respond to what the Lord has put out there. If you are fearing the Lord and honoring him as holy, then it's a sanctuary. But if you are not, it is a stone of stumbling. And Jesus is that stone. That's the leap. That's the jump from Isaiah into the New Testament. Here in the Old Testament, the stone of offense, or the stone that is laid in Zion, is not defined. It could go different ways. Some people might say, well, it's the temple. Obviously, that's in Zion, and that's a structure there. It's built of stone. Maybe it's the temple. Some people would say, well, maybe it's the Torah. Maybe it's the law that God gave. That's the precious cornerstone. And if you are holding on to that, then you're safe. And if you are not, then it will become stumbling. There's different ways to understand the stone when we come to it in Isaiah. But when we come to it in 1 Peter, it's clearly Jesus. Jesus is that stone. He is now the thing that defines whether you are safe or in peril, is how you respond to Jesus. He is the cornerstone, and he is the reliable stone, the precious stone that we can hold on to. If we will hold to Jesus, everything else is not a problem. But if we don't hold on to him, we're going to stumble over him to our own destruction. Paul will bring Isaiah 28 and Isaiah 8 together when he quotes it. I wanted to go back a little bit and get the full context. This is Romans chapter 9, verses 27 through 33. And Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will be saved, for the Lord will carry out his sentence upon the earth fully and without delay. And as Isaiah predicted, if the Lord of hosts had not left us offspring, we would have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it? That is, a righteousness that is by faith? But that Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. They have stumbled over the stumbling stone, as it is written, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. I wanted to put in that larger context because Paul has already been quoting Isaiah. In fact, we've looked at some of these earlier verses in Romans 9 because he quoted Isaiah, and we were looking at those connections. Well, the end of this section is another quote from Isaiah, the one we just looked at. But notice how it's different. Paul tweaks the quotation and stitches together the idea of God laying in Zion a stone from Isaiah 28, but that the stone is a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, which comes from Isaiah 8. And he puts it all together in this quotation, which this kind of thing where different passages are brought together happens quite often in the New Testament. We saw some of that when we walked through the book of Revelation, quotes from different places being blended together. Not to do disservice to either of them, but to show how all of these passages are working together to reveal the truth, and the truth about Jesus. Because again, in Paul, as in Peter, the stone of stumbling, the rock of offense is Jesus. And when we come to Christ and we do not put our faith in him, he is a stumbling stone to us. But if we do, then he is the precious stone that we will believe in and not be put to shame. Let's move on to Isaiah 29 and verses 9 through 10. Astonish yourselves and be astonished. Blind yourselves and be blind. Be drunk, but not with wine. Stagger, but not with strong drink. For the Lord has poured out upon you a spirit of deep sleep, and has closed your eyes, the prophets, and covered your heads, the seers. This is part of the section in Isaiah 29 where I said that there are different reasons for not responding to the words of prophecy. And the first one is intentional, willful ignorance. That's the beginning with this passage, blind yourselves and be blind. This is an intentional turning away. They blind themselves to the truth. And they get drunk, but not with wine. I'm not exactly sure how to understand what Isaiah means, that they're getting drunk, but not with wine. But the second main reason why the people may turn away is because God has designed it. The Lord himself has poured out upon you a spirit of deep sleep and has closed your eyes. In the Hebrew of the text, the word the prophets doesn't seem to be grammatically part of the sentence. It seems like somebody has explained what the metaphor of the eyes means. When it says the Lord has closed your eyes, what he means is he is no longer giving a word to the prophets. And when he has covered their heads, he has stopped giving them wisdom through the seers. We normally think of the prophets and the seers as kind of being the same group. Interesting here that they seem to be different groups, one associated with the eyes and the other one with their heads. Nevertheless, the main point is that God is no longer communicating his truth through the prophets or the seers because he has decided that they're not going to respond. The Lord himself has put upon you a spirit of deep sleep. In other words, you're not going to understand. Well, Paul is going to pick up on this phrase as well when he talks about why the people of Israel, the Jews, have not responded to the gospel as one possible reason why Israel as a collective, not every individual Jew, but Jews generally have turned away from the gospel. He says in Romans 11, verses 7 through 8, what then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. So to some degree, Paul is saying maybe it is a divine providence that the Jews have not responded to the gospel message. As a group, he does say that the elect obtained it. I think that reference would be to the people who did hear the gospel and responded to it. The 5,000 there in Acts chapter 2 would be a perfect example. And other groups of Jews. There were Jews who heard the gospel and responded, and they would be called the elect because they responded faithfully to the message that was presented to them. But for others, they were hardened. Now, the word hardened is key here. It's the same word that is used in Romans to describe what happened with Pharaoh when his heart was hardened against releasing the Israelites and letting them go to worship the Lord and leave Egypt. And I believe that the word hardened points to the idea that the person has already made a choice against God, but is kind of wishy-washy in that position, like Pharaoh was. Pharaoh sometimes let them go or said he would, and then he changed his mind. And then he said he'd let them go, and then he changed his mind. But God hardened Pharaoh at some point to where Pharaoh stopped changing his mind. He just said, no, I'm not going to let them go. And he stood by that decision. He hardened his heart, by making that firm decision to stand by his conviction that the Israelites should not leave and stop being wishy-washy about it. And I think that may be what we have going on here. Not that God would have prevented anybody from receiving the gospel had their nature and tendency and heart been open to that message, but he hardened the people who were wishy-washy about it and not sure if they wanted to or not, and they're kind of on the fence. Well, if you're on the fence, you're not embracing Christ. If you're on the fence, you're turning away from him. And that may be what Paul is saying when he says they were hardened. They made a decision against Christ, and then God hardened them with the spirit of stupor so that they would continue in their willful rejection of Christ. Let's look at Isaiah 29, verses 13 through 14. The Lord said, "Because this people draw near with their mouth and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me, and their fear of me is a commandment taught by men, therefore, behold, I will again do wonderful things with this people, with wonder upon wonder, and the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the discernment of their discerning men shall be hidden." God says the people are going by rote through their devotions to me, but they don't appreciate my power, my ability to do wondrous things. And so he's going to do wondrous things in order to warm their hearts and change their attitudes so that it is no longer simply going through the motions, but out of the sense of awe for God's power. And all of their intellectualism, the wisdom of their wise men, is going to seem like nothing compared to the power and wonder that God is going to do. And speaking of wonders, releasing the Israelites from captivity in Egypt is the quintessential wonders that God has done up through the time of Isaiah. Now, when we look back, there was something more wondrous yet. The coming of Jesus and the incarnation of God to dwell among men was a wonder of wonders beyond even the Exodus. But in Isaiah, that is typically what would come to mind with the wonderful things, the wondrous things that God would do. But Jesus points out that what Isaiah has promised of God doing wondrous things again is coming true through him, because again, the people had become dry and doing things not out of honor, but simply out of rote. The people draw near with their mouth, they honor with their lips, only with their lips, and not with their hearts. And that needed to change, and Jesus said so. And this comes from Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 8. Now, when the Pharisees gathered to him, to Jesus, with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, according to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" And he said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.' You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men." The Pharisees were doing things just because they're supposed to, without really loving God, having that awe and wondrous things. Here, Jesus does not quote the part about doing wondrous things among them. I think it's interesting he doesn't quote it because he is the wondrous thing that is going to change hearts and show people that God is near and powerful through the resurrection. But he quotes to them the problem that they have while he himself standing in front of them is the solution. The answer to their cold hearts is embracing Christ and the power that he represents as the incarnate God and the power over death that he will exhibit 3 days after his crucifixion. The problem was not so much that they were honoring with his lips, but they were only honoring them with the lips. And then the problem was that they were teaching as a commandment things that were only human tradition and not truly commandments from God. And in Isaiah, the part that Jesus didn't quote when he was confronting the Pharisees, but in Isaiah, there is this part in verse 14. He says, I am going to do wondrous things. So there's the problem. God is not going to respond to their lack of passion by punishing them. Instead, he's going to respond to their lack of passion by doing something wondrous that will stir up that passion. He will again do something wondrous so that they will respond passionately to him and honor them not only with their lips, but with their hearts as well. And I think that gets to Paul's use of the same passage. He fills in what Jesus didn't say with the other half of this at the end about the wisdom of the wise perishing and the discernment of discerning men being hidden. He quotes it again in Pauline fashion, not exactly word for word, but he makes the point. He uses the essence of the phrase. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 and 19, Paul says, for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. In other words, he could say, it is the wondrous thing that God has done. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. It is God in his power that is going to change the equation. It is the cross. Then the cross is that point. It is the thing that God has done in wondrous ways to bring about the change of the heart, not through an intellectual argument, but by overcoming death in the person of Jesus Christ, the wondrous thing that he has done. Thank you again for joining me as we walk through the book of Isaiah. I always enjoy walking through the passages with you, and I look forward to our next opportunity to examine the treasures in the biblical text. Until then, may the Lord be with you.